Good morning, and thank you for joining us today in our session entitled Women's Participation in the Labor Force. We're hoping to come up with ideas and solutions on how to boost women's participation in the labor force. My name is Mina Al-Arabi. I'm the Assistant Editor-in-Chief of Al-Sharq Al-Awsat newspaper, who's proud to partner with the IMF for this session today. And we have a wonderful panel here. I'm going to introduce them starting with my left. We have Ambassador Milan Verveer, who's Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. Next to her is Kathy Matsui, who's Chief Japan Strategist for Goldman Sachs. And then Dr. Azeema Adam, who's Governor of Maldives Monetary Authority. May Habib, who's co-founder of Cordoba.com, and Sarah Iqbal, who's the program coordinator for Women, Business, and the Law Project at the World Bank. We're really keen to have today's conversation be a discussion with you, the audience, and also with us here at the panel. As you can see, it's an all-women's panel, which we're happy about, but we had invited participation from several men in both the public and private sector. Unfortunately, they were unable to come. So the onus will be on the male participants in the audience to give us their voice. So be prepared. What we want to talk about here is not to discuss the participation of women in the workforce as though it's an issue of equality or values, although it is, but really about it being the smart choice, a matter of economics. And that's where the conversation will go forward. We want to discuss how we can get both the government, private sector, and even civil society to engage on this issue because it would help with growth. And many of the conversations of the next few days here in Washington will be about increasing growth, will be about meeting the challenges of the 21st century. And you can't do that unless you're going to have over 50% of your populations fully engaged in the workforce, but also in other parts of the life. And so on average at the moment, there's a 50% average of female labor force participation. But that is globally, and it's quite deceiving. Because in the Middle East, where I'm from, it's only about 21%. On the flip side, you've got over 70% in many of the G7 countries, to the exclusion of Italy and Japan. And that's quite good. So we need to look at it regionally and see what are the success stories, and how can we emulate some of those examples. And so I'm going to start with my first question to Azeema and ask her about, one, the role of government, but also the example of the Maldives, where you've broken several glass ceilings. You're also the first woman to become the governor of the Monetary Authority, amongst other accomplishments that you have. So what examples of success can you give us from the Maldives, but also from other emerging economies?
Thank you very much. Before I start, I'd like to just say that I haven't really thought much about the women issues in the Maldives or around the world. I'm more of a central banker and have been more focused on that. But I think the reason why I haven't been able to really think about is because since leaving school, I worked at the Central Bank of the Maldives Monetary Authority. And I've never felt that there is a glass ceiling there. I used to make coffee for my boss, but I always told my colleague, one day I'm going to be the governor. So I didn't mind doing those kind of things. I didn't even think that why are they asking me, but not my male colleagues. I never questioned that. But I always knew that if I work hard, I'll be the governor. But when I look at the statistics now, at the executive level of the MMA, the central bank, we have got 16, and out of that, 11 are female. And among the managerial staff, we have got about 60 or close to 70% are female. So most of the staff at the central bank, and these are not stereotypical jobs that women hold all across the world. These jobs are held by females. Lately, I've been also wondering why MMA is different to the rest of the world, and in fact to the rest of the country as well. In the civil service in the Maldives, once again we have got a huge female participation. But the sad thing is that it is at very low levels, at middle levels, not at the senior levels. Now, as I said before, I didn't question the female participation or the role of women in the labor force. But when I go to the state functions or conferences, I find myself to be one of the few women that are represented there. So I think for the Maldives, we need to change that. We need to see how we can get females to go up higher to the senior levels. But I think at the government level, there are a lot that can be done. One thing that is difficult as a mother for me as well is that there is very limited child care services. That is one of the biggest hindrances. Another thing is the education system, school hours. Mm-hmm. School hours in the Maldives starts from 7 to, there are 2 sessions in some schools, and in other schools it's from 7:30 to 1:30. Work hours are from 8 to 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock. So parents find it difficult to manage that. So a lot of women tend to leave a workplace after they get married or have kids. It's always a struggle. I'll tell you a little story about, I'll make it short, but I thought I'll share that with you. Just a few weeks ago, I went home a bit early than usual, at around 4:30, me and my husband. And my 2 kids, they were very excited. They said, "You're home early." And it was very hard to tell them, no, we are home early, but we have to leave at 6:30 for a state dinner that was held for the president of China who was visiting our country at that time. So when I was getting ready, my daughter came to my room and I was talking to her, and I asked her, "Do you want me to stay home?" And I actually was a bit scared to ask because she might say yes. But she said, "No, I think you are doing a very good job, and I like you being a very important person, and I like that you are doing something very good for the country." But there's always a but. She said, "But what I don't like is when some teachers say something about it." Recently, one of my teachers, a male teacher, said, "So your mom was too busy to come to the parent-teacher meeting." And she said, "I know you were busy. I know you called my teacher and explained, and that was the only time I missed it. The thing was, my husband was also away at that time." But what she said was, "I understand, but it is that it seems to my friends that you don't care about me." So obviously at that age, it's what their friends think about. But this is, I think, what we need to change. I think as Madam Lagarde said, we need to change the mentality to 21st century. We need to change the ingrained inequality rather than just policies are not enough. We need to make sure teachers, family, government, everyone understands that women needs to work, and that by missing a parent-teacher meeting, you are in no way neglecting your child.
Well, that's interesting because I think also for men it's a trade-off. I mean, but it's almost accepted. Like you said, you wouldn't hear that comment coming. You'd hear it much more when it comes to women. But that's part of what the discussion has been in Japan, Cassie, regarding womenomics, which is so important because it's the realities of day-to-day life, of childcare, of expanding childcare support, but also at the very top, the government making those realities come true for women.
So I don't know how much of the audience is familiar with this womenomics agenda that the Prime Minister has launched in Japan. To be perfectly honest, many of us living in Japan and watching the statistics, Japan ranking a whopping 105 out of 138 countries on the Global Economic Forum's ranking of gender parity, etc., the Prime Minister coming out in a very bold way and announcing that womenomics, i.e. increasing female participation in Japan, was going to be a key to the national growth strategy, we said, well, that sounds great, but the reality is quite different. How are we going to achieve these very audacious and ambitious goals? But the reality, as many of you know, unlike some of the developing countries in the world, is that Japan is facing right now with a shrinking, rapidly shrinking and aging population. There's actually more children than children under the age of 15. Sorry, less. There are more pets than children under the age of 15 in the country, just to give you some feeling of how sort of crisis-like the demographics are. And so we actually have been talking about this theme for a while, but the reality is if GDP is driven by labor, capital, and productivity, and unless you get a productivity miracle happening in Japan sometime soon, if your work pool is shrinking, then of course your potential growth rate will fall. Also, your living standards could be at risk as well. So I think the Prime Minister at least has elevated this issue to a very high and important level. Ambassador Verveer and I were participating in a very large World Alliance for Women summit that the government hosted just a few weeks ago in Japan. Madame Lagarde was also present as a speaker, and it was a really nice high-profile event, but it was just not just an event, but actually we came away from a very long day, the second day, with some concrete recommendations of steps that the government, private sector, civil society could also take to contribute to increasing the female participation rate in Japan. Finally, we've done some hypothetical calculations. If you could narrow the gender employment gap in Japan between the females, which is roughly around 63%, to the male employment ratio in Japan, which is close to 81, you could boost Japan's GDP by roughly 12.5% to 13%, which is not small. So while it is a very much a stretch target and a stretch goal that the government's put out, we think the prize lying at the end of that goal could be quite tremendous, especially for a country that's faced with such a demographic set of challenges like Japan.
Nina, I wanted to say something about the government. Having been in government myself, that as both of our panelists said, there are impediments that stand in the way of women's workforce participation. And one of the things that we have brightly spelled out up there are solutions. And I think we really do have to tackle this barriers issue, because one of the critical obstacles that women confront, let's say in growing small and medium-sized enterprises, are the hurdles that they have to confront. And the World Bank did a study not too long ago that surveyed some 140+ countries and found that over 90% have at least one law that's standing in the way. So think of all of the laws on the books, the places where women have no property rights, no rights to inheritance. How do you enhance productivity even for agricultural workers, of whom women are predominant in many countries, but they have no rights to property? So I think we really, government isn't the only actor, but government is a big part of the solution. And so what we heard about the situation in the Maldives and now in Japan, what is being attempted, we all have to, you know, wherever we sit in government or in multilaterals, realize that there are impediments on the books, tax policies, child care policies, any number of things that have to be addressed. And in addition to that, government has the power to create incentives. So I think this whole role of government is a really important one.
And that links into the World Bank and the work you do. I mean, as much as government should be taking this forward, how much can you put that as part of your programs and part of the discussions that you have with the countries that are really facing an impediment in pushing these barriers?
Thank you so much, Mina, and thank you, Milan, for mentioning sort of the study that we do in Women, Business, and the Law. We actually map at a very micro level where there are impediments to women's participation in the labor force. And let me give you some examples of laws on the books. In terms of job restrictions, in the Russian Federation, there's a regulation whereby 456 jobs women cannot do because they are women. Not nursing mothers, not pregnant women, but a normal woman like myself can't be a truck driver in the agricultural sector. I can't drive a metro train. I could drive a bus. I could drive a tram, but underground, women can't drive metro trains. And the reason I bring up that example is because a woman in 2008 actually sued the local authority in St. Petersburg trying to get this job. This was in the middle of the financial crisis. It was one of the few jobs that was actually hiring, but she couldn't do it because she was a woman. And the question is, are we trying to protect women, or are we really impeding them? And I do think some of these laws are on the books to protect women, but the balance shifts. And it really sort of locks women out of the labor force, and we need the government and the private sector to come together. A great example of this would be in the Philippines. There was a night work restriction in the Philippines whereby women couldn't work at night, and the business processing outsourcing industry actually came to the government and said, look, we want women to be able to work at call centers at night. Women wanted to be able to work in call centers at night. This was a booming industry, and they shifted this law. They changed it to allow this, and this really came through from the private sector and the government working together along with civil society. And I think it's that kind of partnership. And the exercise of really mapping these restrictions, oftentimes governments don't know what's on the books.
Yeah.
They don't know what's locking women out. And you talk to policymakers, we've talked to policymakers in many countries. There's a restriction on the books in about 10 to 15 countries whereby husbands can stop their wives from working. They can get them fired if they believe the employment is not in the interest of the family. And I myself have sat across the table from policymakers in certain countries, pointed this out to them, and they'll say, no, 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 this is not something that's on the books. And you actually show them the law. And they're very surprised, but there's often one woman in the delegation, she'll stand in the back and she'll be nodding when I explain this because she knows. But the 10 men in the delegation, this doesn't really rise up to them because it's not an issue that they confront in their day-to-day lives. This is something that their wives confront, that their daughters confront. And I actually think the IMF has a big role to play in these issues, because just talking about it, the research that you've done, the report that you put out on gender equity, Christine Lagarde's speeches on this issue, it really brings to the forefront why this matters and why this matters for governments. At the bank, oftentimes this is something that we talk about with gender ministries, ministries of women's affairs, and of course that's very important, but what's even more important is for central bankers to be aware of this, for finance ministers to be aware of this, for this to really sort of rise to their level as a core economic issue.
Exactly, because that's the point, that it is a core economic issue. All too often it is seen as just something that's looking at society. And of course, you can't separate society from economics and politics, but it's all too often marginalized. May, I wanted you just to comment about this issue of the role of government for small and medium enterprises. How important is it, in your view, in your experience, for governments to take on this top-down approach of saying we have to create the space and legislation, if necessary, to allow women to flourish?
I think in the region where our company is based, we're in Dubai, the government should definitely be commended for doing way more than any other government in the region to address the problems that SMEs have. And when SMEs are creating the vast majority of private sector jobs, it's certainly the sector to encourage. But when it comes to female-specific policies, there's not a single government in the region that has done anything to address the needs of a female labor force. We have 31 employees in Dubai. 16 are women, and it's up and down the organization. It's amazing. We're opening up an office in San Francisco, and the fact that we have gender parity is a huge recruiting advantage in San Francisco, where we have women who have held top positions at Facebook and Google. So excited to finally be working with female engineers and, you know, a lot of women and not be in a completely male-dominated atmosphere. It's funny that in the US it's a recruiting advantage. In the region it goes completely unnoticed, right? I mean, we get no props or credit for it at all. And I think one reason why we've been able to do that is I am super flexible when it comes to when people work and where they do work. We have our financial director, who is a lovely lady who brings her 1-year-old to the office whenever she's in the office, and it's just become a way of life for us. We have another woman whose kids are with her in the summertime. They're both teenage boys. They intern with us. One of them is in engineering, one of them is in design. So for us, we've really let our employees, both male and female, blend their personal and professional lives. And, you know, as an employer, it's only benefited us. I mean, we have grown so much since we have adopted these policies. And, you know, they weren't really conscious. You know, I didn't set out and say, I want a female-friendly. It wasn't that. It was just very natural for us to be accommodating to high-performing employees, no matter what the gender was. The region, though, is becoming so depressing. It's really a tale of two cities. I mean, on the one hand, you have women in Iraq and in Egypt afraid to show up at workplaces for fear of being intimidated, or worse, in Iraq, assassinated or assaulted. When you have some of the most populous countries completely accustomed to almost 100% male workforces, when in Saudi, if you want a job, you actually have to work in a separate office and a separate entrance. You need to have a separate bathroom if you're a female. You know, I'm shocked that the number is 21% for the region. I would have thought it was way lower, just judging based on my personal experience. So unfortunately, government is definitely not a solution. They, if they're functional or have much broader concerns geopolitically than making sure that women are participating in the workforce. And it's unfortunate because, you know, they can add so much when it actually comes to the engines of growth. So it does fall on the private sector, and I think that it's up to the private sector to create new models that can engage women and young people. The unemployment rates for young people are off the charts. They're double for women than what they are for men. One of our models that is very successful is freelance work. So in addition to the full-time staff in Dubai, we have thousands of freelancers who work across the region as editors, translators, writers, designers, and more than 60% are women, and some of our best performers are women. So I do think that offering flexible options to women is really important. And it's not just about childcare. It's about public transportation. It's about how people see you in the community. It's that a lot of the women that work for us are actually still unmarried and live with their families. And, you know, it would not be culturally acceptable for them to, you know, leave the house unaccompanied to go to a job. A lot of them are married with children. And so it's also about being flexible to the needs of a mom.
So Kathy, this takes us back to the issue of the private sector, what the private sector can be doing. While it makes economic sense, at the same time, having freelancers or having quite often women being in the lower paid jobs is actually sometimes a bigger problem because it's almost they get stuck in a rut in there. So what can the private sector be doing differently?
Yeah, and absolutely, I think that the key is here, it's quite easy, I think, in most societies where there is such a gap in gender equality, just to point the finger at the government saying, you've got all these problems. And of course, there's a role to play. The government has huge capacity to change the rules on the books and all of these obstacles. But at the same time, I've often argued that it can't not just be the government's role. Private sector and civil society as a triad approach has to cooperate together to attack all these problems simultaneously. But I think in the private sector, just a couple of things that, just in my experience, and again, I'm more developed country experience than developing, but I would say, one thing is, if we can, we've all talked about this issue for so many years, it seems pretty obvious, given the multitude of studies that have been done, that there is an economic case for, let's just say, diversity in general. I'm not just talking about gender diversity, but just diversity in general. With the war for talent that is going on every place around the planet, if you, as a private sector enterprise, want to attract the best quality talent, full stop, no matter what the gender, no matter what the ethnicity, no matter what the religious background, you have to have a workplace that is going to offer, like May said, flexible work arrangements. Because I've found, frankly, just talking to young males, frankly, who come into the finance world, and you think they're, sort of real, how do you say, progesterone-filled, real macho guys. They actually care about, when they ask about work-life, it's the life part that they're more interested in than, say, I would have been asked 15 or 20 years ago. So I think, given the new realities of the value sets of young people, we as private sector employees really have to keep up with those interests and those priorities, not just of the women. I think we'd be all surprised to find the men are just as concerned about their work-life balance as I think we women tend to be. So it's really about making that economic case. It helps the bottom line. It's going to help your enterprise succeed if you create a work environment that is going to be, welcoming to everybody, but particularly the best quality talent that you want to attract. I think secondly, I would say that I think the private sector, we're talking about a lot of women taking up the lower ranking jobs. It's absolutely the same in Japan. Just for an example, 40% of all workers in Japan today, given the prolonged deflation period we've experienced, are temporary workers. 70% of those temporary workers are female. So we talk about a gender gap in pay in Japan, 70% to 100% for men. That is explained by the fact that women tend to take these lower paying temporary jobs. I've talked a little bit in the past about the Dutch model. I think in the Netherlands they had this huge gap between temporary and full-time, but they managed to get the private sector, the government, the unions, together at a table to say, look, this is not acceptable. We should be paying equal pay for equal work. And I've been trying to encourage the Japanese government to move a little bit closer and eliminate that gap so that women and men can flip. They can go in a certain part of your life cycle, you want to work full-time, and other times you want to go, 60%. So have the freedom to adjust and not be penalized for taking a temporary or part-time role. So I think there's a lot of things the private sector can do that's not government related, or they can't use the excuse that the government has a role that they can't change, but just change it yourself, right, and offer that. Because if you do that, I think you're going to be well ahead of the curve to attracting and retaining the best quality talent.
Milan, regarding talent, there's been a lot said about chief executives being women, and different quotas have been set. There was the famous Davos moment when they said delegations that were coming or participants had to have at least one of their 5 white badges coming as actually being women. But are quotas a solution? Is that a way to push up women into the executive positions?
Well, sometimes they are a solution, but I think there are other examples of what may contribute to getting to a place where women need to be. There's a lot of discussion today about corporate boards as well as upper-level management where there is still a scarcity of women participating. I have a friend who says it's not just the glass ceiling or the sticky floor, however you describe it, it's a thick layer of men, and they're impenetrable. And so how do you begin to penetrate? And I think first and foremost is the data we have today. Some of it emanating from the IMF and other sources, a lot of it from the private sector or expert organizations that shows a correlation between women in high-level decision-making positions and the profitability of companies. So that you begin to understand that if you want your company to be more profitable, and which company doesn't want to be more profitable, you really do have to address the diversity issue. One of the big correlative issues in all of this is the purchasing power of women. Today it's in excess of 75, bordering 80%, huge trillions of dollars that women command. That translates into what they buy in terms of services and products. So again, if your company isn't diverse, how are you addressing the desires of the people with the purchasing power? So I would say several things. That certainly in terms of the public sector, the government, one can do what Prime Minister Abe has done, and we'll see how it works, which is basically to say we're going to put a spotlight on the public companies to tell us how many women they have in high-level positions. And so if you're part of the public or the purchaser, you look at what is this company doing juxtaposed to other companies. Within companies, some have set diversity targets for upper management. the CEO of Renault Nissan, who has been very outspoken about the benefits of diversity, has actually, for some senior positions, designated a quota in those positions. So I think there is a variety of ways to go at it, and we do have to be smarter about it, but it's in everybody's interest. And I think that's one of the things that has changed today, as you said at the outset. It is the right thing to do, but it is also the smart thing to do, which is why I think companies, maybe reluctantly, are beginning to see they might be reluctant on changing their attitudes and mindsets about the ways things have always been done. But if they really want to grow their companies and their profitability, they have no choice but to really begin to move women up. And one last thing I would say is women themselves have to be part of the solution, which is develop those skill sets, grow in confidence, seize opportunities. And one of the best ways within a company is to get into those line positions over segments of the company that eventually will propel her into a much higher level position.
As we've seen, Azeema, you were able to do, to work your way up. So in order to achieve that, to work your way, whether it's in the private sector or in the public sector, what are the key support networks that you need? I mean, we all have this conversation about you need a supportive family, you need a supportive environment within your workplace, but it has to be something more. What would you say was the magic formula?
I think support will come once again, from more understanding by everyone in the country, or not just the men, but also the women. One thing that I'd like to just mention is that recently there was a Facebook page created named Petition Against MMA, that's the central bank. And the main thing is that they accused the governor of discriminating men at MMA. And I said, this is a first. Normally you have women being discriminated. And the main reason for that is that I recently introduced a 6-month paid maternity leave obviously for women. And that is the first for the Maldives. And there were a lot of comments about that in the media. A lot of public were commenting that now everyone at MMA is going to have a baby every year, as if that is the only thing we want to do. And that is the 6 months. Actually, in the Maldives, we get 3 months paid maternity leave. So that additional 3 months is going to make us decide to have more kids. So I think it is understanding from all parts. Unless you understand the situation that women are, understand that women wants to work, and as been discussed here, we cannot afford to let half the population go without producing for the good of the country, without contributing to the GDP growth of the country. In our country, we have, for those who don't know, it's a very small country with about 360,000 people. And if half that population doesn't work, then we have to have a large expatriate population. That doesn't really make economic sense. And for us, coming from a central bank, we have got several issues with regard to foreign exchange. And while we have really productive people working, staying at home, we have a lot of expatriates in the country taking away the foreign currency that we earn and creating a lot of fiscal problems in the country, as well as exchange rate problems in the country. So to deal with macroeconomic issues as well, we need more women participation. And to do that, we need, as May mentioned, we need to have more flexible hours. Women needs to be able to adjust to that, to be able to take care of their kids, but still be able to work And men also need to take equal responsibility in taking care of the kids. It's not just the responsibility of women. Another thing is that what I have noticed is the sick leave. Most women that I know take sick leave when their kids are sick, not when they are sick. They rather come to work and sit rather than be home when they are sick. But when they are evaluated for their work performance, those number of sick leaves that they take reflects negatively on them. So what I have suggested to the civil service now is, why don't we at least try to make an effort to find out when mothers don't come to work, is it because of their children are sick, or just not coming to work? Because in I'm sure 99% of the cases, it is because their child is sick.
Yeah.
So it shouldn't be negatively reflected on them. So those kind of things needs to be changed.
So I'm going to open the floor for questions after addressing one final point. So if you want to prepare your questions, we'll be coming to you shortly. But I wanted Sarah to ask you about an issue that was raised several times in this conversation, which is access to finance, because that's another big impediment. So how has the financial sector changed slightly to allow more access to finance, but still has a very long way to go?
Right, so I think in terms of access to finance for women, there are really two issues we need to look at. One is how financial institutions allow small and medium enterprises to take loans. What is the collateral requirement around that? So for example, several studies have documented on a country and regional basis, women have much less access to land, to real property, to buildings, to houses than men. And especially in the developing world, it's actually quite difficult to get a loan without having real property as collateral. And so that automatically locks women out of getting sort of loans from these banks, especially on the smaller side of the spectrum when they have less access to collateral. But then the question is, how do you look at secured transaction systems? Is it set up in a way that allows women to use the property they do have access to movables, to household goods, to accounts receivable? Is the system set up in a way that allows more owners of small and medium-sized enterprises, in particular women-owned enterprises, to actually utilize the property they do have to get loans? And in a lot of countries, this is actually not the case. And the third part of that would be reputation collateral. How is the credit system set up to allow women to leverage their reputational collateral in order to take out loans based on past repayment histories? And actually, the United States is a very good example of this. In 1974, the United States passed the Equal Opportunity in Credit Act, and this was actually a landmark because it said, among other things, that there shouldn't be any gender discrimination in credit reporting on the basis of gender and marital status. And I really do want to emphasize the marital status part of it, because what happened when women got married is they couldn't have an individual credit history of their own. It was actually wrapped up into their husband's. So women couldn't get credit cards on their own. They couldn't use any sort of credit repayment history without that. Now they can have individual credit histories. And this actually, you see non-discrimination in credit reporting in several countries now. South Africa has a law on it, the Philippines has a law on it. And the question is not that banks actively discriminate, that credit reporting systems actively discriminate, but they actually just don't consider it. And it locks women and also low-income people out of the system. And the second part is actually looking at sort of basic financial inclusion, basic financial literacy. So if you think about it, what does it take to open a bank account? You need to get past the first hurdle, which is know your customer requirements, basically based on anti-money laundering, combating the financing of terrorism. So you need basic documentation. In many countries, it's things like an identification card, the national ID card, the passport, documentation of your address, a birth certificate, all of these things that you would assume are natural, but as a woman, you may have less access to. There are several countries in the world, to get a national identity card, you actually need your husband's permission. Think about what you needed to get into this building right now. What kind of documentation did you need to provide? If you don't have access to that, you're not going to get past the first step. And that means the seventh step down the line, you won't even get there because you're already locked out of the system. So the question is, what can countries do to improve financial access, financial inclusion for women? Are there things like tiered KYC that allow for lesser documentation for lower value accounts? You know, countries like Nigeria have actually introduced this to allow more women, more low-income people to have access to basic financial inclusion. So the question is, are people locked out from the outset, or are policies more inclusive? And I think the question is really, policies are set up for a specific reason. Of course, it's very, very important to have good KYC requirements, to comply with AML, CFT, combating the financing of terrorism, but are you unintentionally locking people out? Are you unintentionally locking women out? Are you even considering this when you frame the policy? And I would say largely, in the beginning, the answer would be no.
Could I?
Yeah, absolutely.
I
Go ahead.
just, such excellent things that you just put out. I think another issue is disaggregated data. You know, there are a lot of financial institutions. If you go to them and say, why aren't you lending to women-run SMEs? They'll say, well, we do lend to SMEs, but they don't have the disaggregated data, and when an attempt is made, it's just, you know, the women really are at the short end of the stick. So I think data is a big issue because some banks are demonstrating increasingly that this is a strong market for banks if they would get into it. But there is a hesitancy, there is a view, improper view, and we need more data on this to show that women aren't risky in terms of a bank's investment. Now, years ago, I remember in the United States, a group of women who were trying to set up a small business had everything they needed to have, a strong business strategy, a niche in the market. They knew what they were going to do. They needed that loan. And they said, the best ideas die in bank parking lots. It is really one of the biggest impediments. And I think what the IFC and others have done, IDB, et cetera, to guarantee some of these loans, because otherwise it's that experience that a bank has. You mentioned Nigeria. When they had a loan guarantee program, one of the institutions I remember said these were among the best loans we ever made because women paid their loans back.
Yeah.
And then I think the finance minister, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, said, well, look, we really need a mandate to other banks to invest in this space because it's all about growing our economy. So the guarantees and what private sector is doing, you know, Coca-Cola has guaranteed $100 million through the IFC in Nigeria. Goldman Sachs just announced a guarantee of up to $600 million that is in process for SMEs in the developing world. So I think with what was said about collateral and all of those issues, absolutely on point, and then addressing the other side of that or an additional side of that would give a stronger basis to growing SMEs, women-run or women-owned SMEs.
Because women-owned SMEs, I mean, it's about 30 to 35% globally. SMEs are women-owned. However, only 10% of those actually got lending. So May, I wanted to ask you, does that mean basically for a female entrepreneur to succeed, she basically has to come from a wealthy background and somebody's willing to give her up the money through irregular lending means, either through family or somebody who really believes in her idea?
Short answer, yeah. In the developing world.
True.
We've grown through the most expensive kind of capital there is, equity financing. And part of it has been that, you know, when we launched, it was a risky idea that's been proven. But right now, even though anywhere in the world, you know, our P&L would get us at least revenue-based financing at great terms, there is no one in the region who we could ever borrow from. Not that I'd want to. We're doing fine. But if we did want to go through debt financing, literally there's nowhere we could turn. And I've explored it just to make sure that, you know, you have all of the options and you know what you're turning away when you do decide to raise money for equity. And it would be easier, let's put it this way, it would be easier for one of our tiny Emirati angel investors to get a personal loan and sign it over to me than it would be for us to get a loan that is backed by our assets and by our revenue stream.
And that goes back to the point of data, because often we don't know about these stories. It could be a personal loan that was handed over. Okay, so I will open the floor to questions now. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and if you can identify yourself, but also if there's someone particular on the panel you'd like to address the question to, then go ahead. Lady over here.
Thank you. My name is Fenoise Namaré, and I come from Brookings Institutions. Huh? Can I? Okay. So my question is for Kathy. There is a report, we say that women who are, female-aided enterprises here in the U.S. are really performing well. But there is a research from the World Bank, for example, that in developing countries, especially in agriculture, even if women have access to the finance, to the land, their productivity is lower. And I think the reason for that is because there is no support network, and the women are still doing a lot more than male. So what is Japan doing? That could be an example that they are putting in place now to encourage women's labor force participation.
In the entrepreneurship arena or in companies?
In general, the support network that we have talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and also thank you, Sarah, for pointing out that credit history reporting. I think that's really interesting because a friend of mine, for example, got divorced here, and she's American, and she couldn't get a credit history because everything was behind her husband, and that's something that was shocking, that we didn't know that, in the U.S. you have everything, you have gender equality, but actually you don't. So, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so Kathy, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think one, in terms of the entrepreneurship space, just to begin with, I think you're absolutely right that even in countries where the access to credit isn't a huge obstacle, it actually used to be pretty bad in Japan. You couldn't get a credit card if you were single female, for example, not that long ago. And now it's gotten a lot easier. But even if you cleared that hurdle, I think in a lot of the countries that many of us are involved with or touch, the issue happens to be that, networking, that support system that seems a bit more natural for the men for some reason, but not so natural for the women. And if you look at surveys that have been done in Japan for entrepreneurs, male and female, the males still respond to the question, what is the number one obstacle to building a business? It is the credit, it's the finance answer. Number one, and for women, it's not number one. It's actually number two or number three. The number one obstacle is the lack of sort of horizontal networks, support groups, people who they can lean on, who they can ask questions, they can bounce ideas off of. It seems like almost a ridiculous thing, but that seems to be a very large obstacle. I think I've heard not just in Japan, but in other contexts as well. And I think other than that, in the private sector, in terms of how to, kind of promote female participation and what are the things that can be done, I think there's a lot to be said for sponsorship programs. Milan was talking about the issue of, the sticky layer of men, but I think it's a lot to do with the same kind of thing that we women, we're just so busy, right, with our family obligations. We don't have time to kind of hang around the water cooler maybe as much, and so not artificially, but at a very young stage in women's careers, really invest in them, give these women sponsors so that they have somebody to look up to, not just as a role model, but just to give them tips to be their, almost their megaphone, to brag about what they're doing, to open them up to potential opportunities in other parts of the company and things like that. That's, I think, an area that really isn't a role for government, frankly, but I think in the private sector we could do a lot better job at embracing, because I think we just forget about that. We think, well, you should have that naturally, and we all talk about, oh, you should have a mentor, but it doesn't come so naturally, I think, for women in general, in my experience.
And sort of going to the second part of your question, I think one of the things that we found actually was very interesting is out of the 143 countries that we surveyed, 90% across the developing world, across the developed world, had at least one restriction on the books impeding women's ability to participate in the economy. So I wouldn't say that it's a developing country versus developed country distinction, but rather this is across the board regardless of income. And I think what's actually really, really interesting, and it touches on your sort of agricultural inputs question, is basically the research that I've seen from the Food and Agriculture Organization and others, including the World Bank, is that women farmers would be as productive as male farmers, except that they have less access to inputs. And that includes finance, that includes land, but it also includes extension services, it includes access to networks, access to markets. And the question sort of, to me, is very similar in the agricultural space as it is in the entrepreneurship space. It's really access to inputs, whether it's access to government services, networks, what have you. The way these institutions are set up is really in a sort of male-centric model. So it's not that it adapts to the lifestyle that women have. Things like flexible working arrangements, childcare arrangements, the ways that women network. Women actually network in very different ways than men, and if it's not addressed in the way an institution is set up, if you're not looking at it from a gender lens, you may miss it. I have so many colleagues who say, oh, there's no gender issue in credit reporting. There's no gender issue in secure transaction systems. And it's not that it's not there, they're just not seeing it because they're not looking for it. They're not sort of trained to look for it because this is not their wheelhouse. And the only reason that we see it is because we started looking at this research and we really came at it from a different perspective. So the perspective was not, okay, these are women's issues in family law that are preventing them to access the entrepreneurial or environment or employment environment, but rather, what does the business and regulatory environment look like that's impeding women? So we came at it from a different perspective, and what we found is we were actually looking at the wrong things. We need to look at the right things. So for example, you may not see a gender issue in tax systems, but are you looking at secondary wage earners and how they're accounted for in the tax systems? What the incentives and disincentives are for secondary wage earners, the massive majority of whom are women. You know, if women are paying higher taxes because they're making less income and in the family structure, the way that it's structured is actually causing them to pay higher taxes on that income, they may actually drop out altogether because it's not cost effective for them to pay for childcare and pay these higher taxes. You know, it's an internal family decision, but how does the outside of that really factor in? And I think you have to look at it from that lens.
Could I just follow up on the agriculture piece? Because just as Sarah said so eloquently, I'll take you back to an experience when I was in government, and that is one of the most significant development initiatives that the Obama administration has is called Feed the Future, and it's to grow agricultural productivity. And when we were working on this initiative, you know, all of a sudden at one point somebody raised the question of what about women? And then you look at the data, and women are, in many places, the majority of the smallhold farmers. And what was going to be done to enhance their ability, and what were the indicators that we were going to adopt to see if we were actually getting to those farmers? You know, the nutrition levels of their children, for example, their own income, et cetera. And just about at the same time, the FAO, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, put out a study, and they do this annual report, and it was the first time they had ever done it on women in agriculture, and the title of the study was Women Are Vital to Agricultural Productivity. And it's what Sarah said. Their bottom line was, until the inputs or the resources that women farmers have can be equal to what male farmers have, you're not going to grow the productivity levels. And they had all kinds of data about how those levels rise exponentially. And one of the things that I've never forgotten from that study is that if this equalization were to occur, we would be able to feed 150 million more people than we are today, just by enhancing the productivity levels of women farmers. So that's how significant this is. And nobody thinks about agriculture as a women's issue, which is what Sarah, to point, was saying, you know, on its face, it's not a women's issue. But when you look at it, you can't get where you want to go unless you do factor in gender.
So that was my question, actually, because some of these issues aren't women's issues, and then some women step away, and also men. You can alienate them by saying, oh, this is going to become a gender issue, because then they're like, you're almost lessening its importance. And so how do you, when you approach these subjects, how do you avoid that?
I think it's very difficult, and I will say I'll use my own experience as an example. So when we started doing this research in 2008, I think we basically chased after colleagues at the World Bank. And we said, look, we're doing this data, please use it in your projects, be aware of these sort of obstacles to women. And they would just be like, yes, yes, it's another gender issue, and kind of would be not as important as the whole panoply of other issues they have to deal with. In the ensuing years, what's been really nice is to have people like Milan speak about it, to have people like Christine Lagarde speak about it, to have President Kim of the World Bank speak about it. Because when you get sort of higher level attention and spotlights on these issues, to have Goldman Sachs speak about it. Now, I think we have the opposite problem. That people are running after us saying, how do I incorporate gender issues in my project? And we just don't have the supply to meet the demand. How do you look at gender and financial inclusion? How do you look at gender and credit reporting? What is the appropriate lens? I think really the balance has shifted. And at the World Bank, I would say the main shift has been with the World Development Report and really having the research on these issues. I think research is important, but you need people who are working on projects, governments, the private sector to really absorb it. And that's actually been happening now, and it's really, really exciting to see that shift.
There's a lady who's been patiently waiting there.
Thank you very much, Chair, and also a very informative and insightful panel, I must say, that we have there. And before I ask the question, let me just put it into perspective. My name is Naisula Lesuda, a senator from the Parliament of Kenya. And we have made very progressive steps as a country through our constitution and through the legislations that we have there. One, in terms of making sure that the numbers in Parliament and in other government offices is actually entrenched in our constitution. Their third, affirmative action, is entrenched in our constitution. The women are not just ministers, but ministers holding key positions, you know, defense, land, devolution, water, you know, all that. And then foreign affairs and many others. Then secondly, we have laws. For example, 30% of procurement goes to women, youth, and people with disability. And so we're really, really moving forward. We have also the loans, Women Enterprise Fund, which is given to women in small and medium enterprise, and no interest. Now, very quickly, the debate has changed, not just on the numbers, but on what is the quality. You know, so very quickly the debate now amongst the citizens has changed. What is the quality that these women, you know, what is the quality that they're bringing which was not there? And I'd just like from your experiences to share so that the women who are there, how we can navigate through that, which of course is of course not very easy. You know, you're looked at microscope more, especially for the women up there. And then secondly, also the 30% procurement now, we're being told that the women, your uptake of that, you know, we've given you, you should be, the uptake is not as high as we expect. And so very quickly we might start losing on some of the gains that we have made as women and as in the country. And so it would be very interesting to just pick your perspective on how very quickly the debate now is changing on quality and not just the number of women that we have in the labor force. Thank you very much.
Okay, so it's open to the panel, but I guess Azeema, maybe, oh, okay, no, wait, we have volunteers. I won't throw Azeema in the deep end then. Okay, go ahead.
You go ahead.
Okay, Kathy, please.
Well, I'll just throw out and start off. I think that this debate often comes up when countries are dealing with the quota versus not quota question, right? Because in most countries it's, well, a quota sounds good. You're going to reach those targets very quickly, but are you doing a disservice, A, to the country, and B, to the women themselves by putting them maybe in positions earlier than they may be qualified for? At the same time, I think that, I don't know too much about Kenya, but I can tell you from Japan's case, I'm a strong believer or a proponent of quotas in the public sector for that same reason, because I think at the end of the day, if you're a young girl in high school or university and you're looking up and all you see are dark suits, would you even imagine that you could become a central bank governor or a minister or a politician? The answer is mostly in Japan, no, because you don't see those role models. So I think there is a role to play. But to your question, I think in terms of quality, I would say, there's lots of studies about what do women, versus men bring to the table. Well, I think they bring qualities such as empathy. I think they bring qualities such as transparency. They bring qualities like, how do you say, consensus building, right? Not that they're better than the men, but they just have a different set of perspectives. Also risk management. I've seen studies of women hedge fund managers versus male hedge fund managers, and the women tend to perform better because they take more measured risks as opposed to sort of unbridled risk. So there are lots of, I think, statistics one can use to maybe to show the women in your country or to the people who are skeptical about the quality factor that these are just different characteristics that this group brings to the discussion table.
Yeah, as Kathy said, quality is what you bring as being a female. I always say that I will be a woman who leads, not a man. I don't need to be a man to become a leader. So I always have that female perspective within me. And I think for men, that needs to be understood. Leaders doesn't need to be men. It can be a woman, and the qualities that we bring, as Kathy mentioned, it will be very different. One thing is that we show more emotion. That might be taken in the old textbooks of management as something bad. But I think we need to rewrite textbooks saying that emotion is good. It is part of your life, so you don't need to cover up all your emotions just because you are at work. It shows that you are a human being. I think as a woman, you show yourself more than trying to pretend to be something else. So different qualities, even within women, every woman is different. Everyone has different qualities. So it is about bringing all the qualities together. It is not just about bringing one type of quality replacing the another type of quality. It is about bringing all the qualities that we have, whether it's a male or female, together to make any workplace better or any company better, to work and make it better for everyone to work together.
Milan, you want to take it up?
Yeah, I'm always amazed in some ways that public policy is about all of society, men and women, girls and boys, and there's no evidence that if it's monopolized solely by just men that we're going to get the best public policy. And in fact, if we look at the role that women have played with their experiences, talents, perspectives coming into public policy, they bring issues that would never be on the table that are there, that then all of the men with whom they work, or most of them, come together on realizing they have to be addressed. So, this balance that we need in making laws that affect all the people, not just half of the people. But that said, I think there is increasing data about the value that women bring and their perspectives to these positions. And I was talking earlier to one of the officials of the IMF about the experience in India, where they established a quota over a decade and a half ago now for the lowest level of governance, the panchayats. And at first it was sneered at, what are these women going to do? Some of them are illiterate. They're just going to listen to their husbands anyway. This is pure foolishness. And what the data shows, that today they're running for far more than quota positions. There are over 1 million of them. And the data shows they are governing differently, that they are investing public resources in sanitation, in education, in health, in the kinds of things that raise the standard of living for all of the people. Now, that said, that is an important perspective, and we can see it play out in other places. But I think for women in these positions, they also have to improve their effectiveness, because they now are models. And for them to be effective, I've had so many people say to me, well, when she was an activist with the NGO, she knew what needed to be done, and now she's just listening to her party. I mean, how do women become effective across party lines, coming together, demonstrating leadership. It's not enough just to get elected or to be there because of the quota. You have to be effective. You know, I helped start an organization called Vital Voices, and one of the reasons we did it wasn't enough to put women at the table. They had to become effective at the table. And what we found is emerging leaders everywhere want to build their capacity. So I think you need both.
And the procurement uptake, I don't know, Sarah, if you can address that in addition.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to address that. And first of all, I wanted to congratulate you. I mean, the new Kenyan constitution is really a watershed in women's rights in Kenya. Kenya was actually our top performer for the 2012 Women, Business and the Law report. And the constitution throughout Kenyan legislation, it triggered a lot of important improvements for women's rights, including, I think, most importantly, on land, on quotas. On the quota side, I actually have a really interesting example from Norway. So they have a quota, the first quota on women's representation on corporate boards. So they had a 40% quota that companies had to comply with or be delisted from the Oslo Stock Exchange. And actually the same thing happened. You started getting many women now sort of in compliance with this quota on corporate boards, but the women initially weren't as effective. And the reason is because they didn't have the experience. They didn't have the training. They didn't have the capacity building. So the question one is getting women in the position, but also building their capacity, working with them in order to make sure that they're effective. Because of course, if you put someone in a position that they weren't in before, they're not going to have the experience of that position. And actually the same thing applies to procurement. So if you have a 30% quota for women, minorities, and the disabled, odds are that 30% of the segment actually didn't have access to those procurement contracts before. And so the question is how to build their capacity of these women entrepreneurs and others to be effective in delivering the services now that they are getting the procurement for. And it's really a capacity question because all of a sudden they're growing, they have access to this revenue stream that they didn't before, and they may not be used to it. So there's questions of scale, there's questions of efficiency, there's questions of delivery, and part of it is time, but part of it is also building their capacity so that they can deliver and become good role models for the next generation and moving forward. Because the question shifts very, very fast between having women in positions of power, having greater access to women, to, oh, we told you so, they're not as effective, and how do you sort of navigate that debate? I'm happy to actually show you some research from Norway and how they did it and build capacity afterwards.
Excellent. Well, now we have a question from a minority, so I think we've got to give them a chance.
Hi, my name is Taha. I work for the IMF, and my question is about the framing of the issue. It seems to be the trend these days to frame the issue from an economic perspective, where saying that we should not discriminate against women because it's good for the economy. Isn't that kind of degrading for the issue? Because it's more of a moral imperative. Doesn't it? It almost sounds like Martin Luther King walked into the Lincoln Memorial and said, should not discriminate based on color because it's bad for the economy, which is kind of degrading for the moral imperative. Maybe as a moral issue, the results in specific actions would still be the same, but the framing is kind of different.
You know, that's a question that one often hears, especially in this new equation that Mina started our conversation with. And there's a lot to what you said. I couldn't agree more. It is the fundamental issue, are women's rights as human beings, and looking at it in that framework. It is fundamental, no argument with it. But if I were to go into a leader of a country or the head of a company and start talking about women's rights, I get a pat on the head. I'm told there's a young woman I can talk to, and she'd be happy to spend some time with me, but I can't possibly be bothered because what have you got to say to me? If I go in armed with data and make the evidence-based case and show how the growth of the economy, which every country wants to see, the prosperity, inclusive prosperity, jobs creation has a lot to do with this very fundamental rights issue, then the whole discussion changes. And we can have an actual discussion, and we can talk about what needs to be done. I think it's terrible that the moral imperative alone, which I believe with Nick Kristof, who said this is the moral imperative of the 21st century, gender equality. And we're also saying gender equality is smart economics, as Bob Zoellick said when he was running the World Bank. it's not that this doesn't matter the most. It does. But you can't achieve the goals most of us would like to see achieved if you begin and end with that in terms of the kind of work that needs to be done to change large numbers of decision makers, whether they're in the private sector, the governmental sector, civil society, wherever.
And when we were actually discussing this session, this came up because there is the sense, you're absolutely right, this is the right thing to do. There is that moral imperative. This is also a cultural thing, a social thing. There's so many issues that come up. But exactly as Milan said, that on its own doesn't get you very far. When you talk about the economics, it's almost you want to make it two sides of the same coin, and then what the result will be was actually to improve people's lives, men and women, not only just women. And so I think you're right in that the framing of the question shouldn't always be about the economics, and that's why you have to say this is the right thing to do. This is the values-based way of tackling it. However, I'm going to prove to you that economically it makes sense. And I think that's what we're trying to achieve in these conversations and love this discussion, and that's why data is so important. But also what we find is quite often you have different organizations and different groups doing things, but they're completely in different silos or different spheres, and there's very little cross-sharing, which is, again, I think what the IMF was hoping to get out of this discussion. The World Bank is often trying to do of the sharing of experiences scaling up. There was another question just here.
First, I wanted to thank Sarah and her team for the wonderful data they produced. I'm part of our research team at the IMF that's working with your data, and some of the results are quite astonishing. For instance, what you were saying about how different laws affect, I was running the regressions and I noticed that something like women having access to a bank account, it wasn't producing significant results towards female labor participation, and I was confounded with this result. But what you said is true. For instance, there's another variable that you have, that whether women are allowed to work or not. And when I put that variable in interaction together, that's when it works. So it seems like it's layer after layer after layer of law. So you have to go down and down and down deeper on those laws. And when I was reading more specific cases, I was surprised to see the case of Turkey. Up until 2001, women were not allowed to work unless they had permission from their husband. And to me, that was shocking. And also tied to the laws, I was also looking at data on women in parliament, which our colleague from Kenya mentioned. And it's incredible. The correlation is very huge. In countries like the US, I think it was about 17% of women in parliament. It's very low. I think Americans would be very surprised to know that countries like Cuba, Iraq, Afghanistan, China have a higher percentage of women in parliament than the US. And my question is, all these things like how women in Turkey can't work unless they have permission from the husband, that the percentage of women in parliament is 70%, we don't know these things. And my question is, what's the best way to communicate these, and what role does the media play in it?
Sure.
And I worked together on this project. And when he was first showing me the numbers, the impact that these variables were having, I asked him, are you sure? Are you making this up? In terms of the power of what some of these data are. Sorry, I didn't mean to take over his question.
Okay, so we have a question that's been seconded by another one of our audience. So communication. How do you go about it, Sarah?
Communication is huge. I mean, for us, just getting the data out there, getting you to use it, getting Vital Voices to use it, getting Goldman Sachs to consider it, just to make people aware, to make policy makers aware that these things matter. I mean, so we're in the business of measurement, and we have a motto, basically what gets measured gets done. Because if you don't know what your baseline is, if you don't know what the actual data is, if you don't know what the facts on the ground are, how can you sort of work beyond that? How can you build upon that? And I think it's really a sequential approach. First, you measure the data, you see the restrictions, you build the evidence. You do the regressions, you do the papers, you present it to policymakers, and really it leads back to the earlier question. Yes, of course it is a moral imperative. I think nobody denies that it is a moral imperative, but that's not the issue that will really open policymakers' eyes. It's the facts, it's the evidence, it's what Milan said earlier. Really, you have to bring the evidence to the table. And I think what's important too is to look at how the human rights regime played into this. Because what we did is we actually tracked reforms over 50 years. So we took property rights issues and we took legal capacity issues and we counted year by year from 1960 to 2010 where reforms happened in these issues in 100 countries. Because one thing we wanted to make sure of is, the assumption is that developed economies may be further along than this. That's actually not true. We saw, for example, Spain was one of the later OECD economies to reform these issues in the early 80s after the Franco regime fell. That's when they started removing basic legal capacity restrictions on women. I'm talking about basic property ownership. I'm talking about the ability to conduct basic legal transactions without your husband's permission. After Spain did it, and you can time it on a chart, throughout Latin America, Brazil reformed, Argentina reformed, Paraguay, Uruguay. I mean, we have this great timeline actually mapping it out. So it's not that recent, but these things do make a real difference. And I'm not an economist. I don't pretend to be an economist. I'm a lawyer. And so what we started doing is looking at the laws, mapping out these restrictions, and then economists like you, like Kalpana, start looking at the effects, the associations of these variables. I have some colleagues who are looking at our variable on non-discrimination in hiring and finding actually that has a very, very strong association with women's participation in the labor force. I mean, laws do make a difference. It's having the law and it's enforcing that law. So I do think it's a first step, but there are many, many steps after that. It's not the end of the conversation, but really the starting point.
Okay, so we have time for just one last question. Lady right here, thank you.
Hi, my name is Priyanka. I'm actually a student at GW, and it's very interesting to hear you guys talk. It's very inspiring. So my question is, a lot of the times, the majority of opposition for women joining like these higher level positions actually comes from women rather than men. So why do you think that is, and have you seen examples of this in your lines of work?
That women are usually the ones that push back against other women going forward. And this, I think there are so many anecdotes that we can tell, but I think your experiences and why that is.
You know, I have a friend who's a pollster, and she was once in a focus group discussion trying to determine why a certain candidate was getting all of this opposition from other women, the candidate being female. And she said, they didn't need a pollster in that discussion, they needed a shrink, because it was impossible to understand why they were saying the things that they were saying. But I regret, as a woman, that there are so many manifestations of this. Maybe it's because women, in many ways, have been more marginalized, and they're feeling, I got to the top, I don't, want the competition. But I think Madeleine Albright got it right. She said there's a special place in hell for women who pull up the ladder after they've made it to the top. Because really, to the extent we can take our experiences, our opportunities, and reach down and bring others up, that's the way to go. And I hope we get to that place.
I'd also add, I think in where I live in Japan, there is another problem, which is if the women, the mothers, have grown up with their mothers didn't work outside the home, so their expectation when their daughters have children but are very ambitious about their careers and they want to do both, it's why would you, do that? Right. That's very bad for the children. That's not what I did with you, so why would you, even fathom doing that, taking a different path with your life? So I think going back to the earlier question about education, right? We've got to get the media, we've got to get everybody to kind of just drill into people's minds that this is the 21st century, and it shouldn't be an either-or, choice. It should be you can have both. We need to create that opportunity platform for both, for everybody to have that same choice, same opportunity set. So I think that's another maybe role that, or factor that might be playing into this women not really wanting other women to succeed.
Okay, so we've just got about 10 minutes left, a little less actually, 7 minutes. And so I want to give the opportunity to our panel to answer my last question to them, which is, if you could determine one takeaway action for all of us who are here and others who may be watching on the webcast, one takeaway action that can actually make a difference in this very big issue, what would it be? I'll start with you. It's an easy one.
Well, there are so many. And so since this is an IMF-sponsored event and I was once in government, I just want to mention certainly that Madame Lagarde's voice in this arena has been tremendously impactful. I think the reports that have come out have been very impactful. And I think the next step for not just this institution, but others in government, is to keep no longer siloing these issues as women's issues and to really move them in a more integrative way. This is true in companies as well. We've got to see these not as some marginal issues over here that are good issues, but they really don't have anything to do with everything else. And the bottom line is they do. And so how do we, as leaders, in multilateral discussions or in bilateral discussions, not just make a macroeconomic argument on X, Y, or Z, but actually talk about how women are really drivers of economic growth and what's going to be done on all the issues we've been talking about, barriers of one kind, policies that are problematic, et cetera. So I think we need to do a better job of moving this issue from the margins to the mainstream and taking it at the highest levels of decision making.
Kathy.
Well, I think with the exceptions of countries like the Maldives and possibly Kenya, in those countries where the gap is still very, very wide, I have one suggestion, which is at the end of the day, if the women are in the minority group, it's very hard to change the majority if you're in the minority. I often find when I go around talking about diversity that it ends up being a discussion initiated by women, conducted by women, involving only women, and you have all these conversations in a really small microcosm, but it doesn't really change the bigger picture. So engaging the men, at the end of the day, those are the people with the decision-making powers. Those are the people that are the controls to the purse strings of country budgets in many cases. So to the extent that we can engage the men in the public sector, in the private sector, and there's a spectrum. Obviously, this is the real world, so there's a spectrum of beliefs of this is a moral imperative. So I know people who believe it's not a moral imperative. And so how do we convince the people at this end of the spectrum that this is something to believe in? Well, you get the people who are sympathetic, empathetic with the cause in the male community, hopefully as senior as possible, to reach down and preach that message day in, day out, and hopefully that will eventually sort of teach and educate the broader population. So engaging the men is absolutely key in my view.
Azeema?
I mentioned at the beginning that the conversation I had with my daughter before I went to the state function, I went there feeling very bad about neglecting my kids and questioning whether it's all worth this. And when I went there, there were about 150 people there, and over 80 people were Maldivians at senior levels. And I was among the 5 women there. So seeing that, I very quickly forgot what I had, the feelings that I had before, and I thought I really need to take this forward. I really need to talk more about these issues. Otherwise, I'll always be a minority among all the men there. And we can't talk about female participation or any of these issues if we are the minority. We need to have an equal participation. So I think my take on this is that I, as individually, has to do more in making sure I make my contribution to the country by talking about these issues and bringing up these issues. And just very quickly, with regard to legislation, our country is very good in that sense. There are no restrictions for women to work, but then you have to look beyond that for those countries. In our country now, when I grew up, we were told that we could become anything, that we have more choices. But now there is increase in religious fundamentalism, which prevents women to work. And recently there was a big lecture given by a sheikh, Women in Paradise. And guess what the message is? You stay home to look after to the kids and husband to go to paradise or heaven. So we need to make sure that these kind of our minority voices are heard, that we can really stand up to this and say in Islam, women are allowed to work, women are equal to men.
May.
Thanks. I think my suggestion in the world I understand to other business owners, people who employ women, would be to encourage their female employees to really take charge and authentically and persistently demand the kind of model that does work for them. Taking a more flexible work arrangement doesn't mean not performing at the top of your field. Last week we filed a software patent, and one of the authors is one of our engineers who works remotely. Working part-time or not being in the office all the time, or demanding your employer works on your schedule as well as you working on their schedule doesn't mean that you're not contributing at the very highest levels to the organization.
Sarah.
So my takeaway is really the same as Kathy's. I think the number one thing to do to sort of promote this issue is to get the men involved. It shouldn't be a sideline issue. It shouldn't be just a women-only issue. But you really do need to work with the majority, work with the people who are making the decisions. And I think on projects that I've worked on, really the change in mindset, and we've worked with, for example, religious leaders in Pakistan. I've worked on projects in Bangladesh where they work with religious leaders as well, convincing them of the importance of this, the importance for families, for communities, and really sort of getting them on board with the agenda. And when they start talking about the importance of women working outside the home, the importance of women's entrepreneurship, that's when you see the difference in communities. That's when you see the difference in practices, and that's where you really get change on the ground.
Excellent. Well, thank you for those thoughts. Thank you all for attending, and thanks to the IMF for having us here. So yes, a round of applause to our speakers very much. And please keep these conversations going, especially over the next few days here. Thank you.